here to have a bad night. A few housekeeping things that we need to take care of before we go. One of them is, again, restrooms are in the lobby down the hall. Apparently, we all need to know where the fire exits are because the alarm won't stop going off, so that's down through these doors and to the right. We'll meet outside. Just as a general note for our folks online, if you see us all get up and walk away randomly, that's going to be why, because the fire alarm has gone off a couple of times this morning. It's not you, it's us. I'm going to ask Greg to gavel us in, and then we've got some things that we need to clean up from yesterday.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here once again, and looking forward to a good day. Hope you had a great night last night. We've got some good stuff going on today, and let's get started. Here we go.
Thanks. Mike, you had some remarks that you wanted to make this morning.
Yeah. First, after some lengthy research, I did find the article that Steve was talking about yesterday about our shipment to WIP, and we got that to Greg and Charles. So if you want to see what the details are, I wouldn't try to reiterate all the information that was in that. But there's a good explanation. It was in the Weapons Complex Monitor, I think, an explanation of what was going on with that shipment out of WIP. And we're waiting for NRC to recertify the container so that it can be brought back and we can sort it out. But then Mac also asked me why I didn't note in my remarks yesterday about the notice of violation that we got from the South Carolina Department of Health and Environmental Control. And the reason is because James and I are poor substitutes for Amy. And so when we scrambled to put my notes together, we dropped this item out. So we did get an NOV, a notice of violation. It's related to a toxicity testing for the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit. On April 24th, we received the NOV. And really it's because of a miscommunication between us and DHEC about when this test was required. It's called a whole effluent toxicity test, and so a wet test, and it's due every 5 years. So we were confused about the due date for the next one. It is due. We have contracted to get it done. There was no monetary penalty associated with the NOV. It just requires that we complete the test. So I think we're several weeks late now on doing this test. ETT Laboratory, Environmental Laboratory, is currently conducting the test for SRS. It's the only lab certified to conduct the Daphnia ambigua wet test. The standard processes for ETT to ramp up colonies of the Daphnia ambigua water fleas, which normally take approximately 4 weeks, and then the actual test takes about 2 weeks. However, ETT has reported that the Daphnia ambigua bugs are making slow progress reproducing, and as of yet, the reproduction rates do not indicate a healthy colony needed for the test. ETT is substituting different food, water character, temperature, light conditions in an effort to stimulate reproduction. And I would also note that the Daphnia ambigua is a form of podicerin, which is actually a small crustacean. It's not a flea, but it looks like a flea in the water. And the reason we use that particular variety is because in the late 90s, we kept failing the toxicity test, even though there was no toxin in the water, because at that time, our friends at EPA had told us to use the Daphnia dubia, but it was under stress from the low hardness in the SRS water supply. So SRS developed an alternative test, which EPA and DHEC approved. And we subsequently transferred that test to ETT Environmental in Greer, South Carolina, apparently because it's difficult to keep the populations alive for a long period of time, and the test is only due every 5 years. So we offloaded that test to ETT. So that's where we stand on that. It wasn't an insult to the environment, but we are late on performing this test that's due every 5 years. That's it, James.
Thank you. Any questions for Mike about that?
Thank heavens there aren't any, because that's all I know. And I learned most of it this morning.
Fair enough. Okay. We have a pretty straightforward agenda today. We've got 3 presentations this morning that we're going to get through. We'll take a lunch break. We'll come back. We've got a couple more presentations this afternoon, and then we'll do some voting. and then we'll all go our separate ways for the day. Any questions about our agenda and what we need to accomplish today? All right. Mr. Borders, are you ready, sir? Come on down.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I'm Mike Borders. I am the SRMC Optimization and Integration Director, and I'm already very thankful this morning. I'm thankful I didn't have to give the report that Mike had to do. So anything sounded easier than what he just covered, so I'm thankful for that this morning. I'm going to tell you right up front, if I use too many car driving analogies today, I'm just going to apologize. I'm driving to Oak Ridge later today for some meetings tomorrow, so it just seems to flow with the discussion. We'll see how it goes. So today, I'm going to go through the purpose of the presentation. We're going to be talking risk reduction. We're going to be talking about optimizing SWPF and how that relates to risk reduction. And so we're going to go through the high curie processing strategy that I talked to you about last time I was with you, I think was November of 22. So I'll give you an update on that. We'll give you an update on the throughputs with a heavy focus on SWPF and DWPF, which is at the heart of our integrated processing for liquid waste. And then also a brief update on the risk reduction from getting waste out of our old style tanks in the water table. And once again, as I mentioned, I did talk to you all in November of 22, so you'll get an update on that risk reduction strategy that we presented at that time. And then also we're hopeful that things we cover today might support a CAB recommendation related to our optimization priorities from the community's perspective. So obviously we're interested in y'all's input and if our plans seem sound from y'all's perspective. I know we have some new CAB members since I think the last time we spoke, so I was just going to give just a very brief overview. This graphic represents our liquid waste flow sheet, all of our plants. Our mission, the key takeaway from this slide is that everything we need to complete our mission, all the plants that process the waste are built, they're up and online and operating. So we have that advantage over a lot of places around the complex is that everything we need to finish our mission is in place. The last thing that we actually are building are the last 3 SDUs, 10, 11, and 12, which just store some of the decontaminated salt solution after it gets grouted and solidified. But all of the processing plants are online. So the mission that we have is pretty simple at this point. I say it's simple in one frame. As far as conceptually, the work involved is complex. But we remove the waste from the waste tanks. We treat the waste through SWPF and defense waste processing facilities. And then we dispose of the waste. The high activity material we put in glass that comes through DWPF and put in canisters. The lower activity decontaminated stream goes to saltstone, and we make grout that goes into the SDUs. And then some of the concentration of waste in the tank farm, when we do that with the evaporators that you can see over here, when they do run, they actually help bring some water off of the waste and concentrate the waste down, and that water gets cleaned up to releasable to state waters. And then the canisters are currently stored on site in the glass waste storage building. Once again, we have all that we need there. Those buildings with the double stacking that we're doing will hold all of the cans that we're going to process. And we are still taking some waste from the canyon that goes on the front end of our process. So that's our mission, and we're very dedicated to that as a collective team. So this dashboard, we call this a dashboard, kind of graphically shows you the state of our mission. And with the purpose of this, and it's a little bit busy, but it's to kind of show you we know exactly where we are with respect to what's done. We know what's left to be done to finish the mission. And just looking across the top, there for the total mission, if you look at our system plan, is about 19 sludge batches that have to be processed through DWPF. 9 of those are complete. We're currently processing batch 10. You can see for salt batches to go through SWPF that we're projecting 102 batches that we'll make up and feed, of which we're through batch 7, about to move batch 8 over in the next month or so. If you look at the waste retrieval and closure for the tanks, out of all the tanks that we have, 51 waste tanks, waste removal is complete on 15 of those, and 8 of those 15 are closed and grouted. And if you look at the canister projection down here, Total number of cans that we're going to make over the life of the mission is just north of 8,000 canisters. We're over halfway there already with all the sludge processing and integrated processing we've done to date. And then here you can see the status of our STUs, those that have been filled, those that are currently filling, which are 3B, 6, and 7, 8, which was just finished, 9 is almost done, and then 10 through 12 are the last 3 that we're building, just starting to do ground clearing and initial preps or initial start of construction of cell 10. So this slide is an exact duplicate of a slide from November of 22, and the purpose for putting this in here is just to once again talk about our focus, both for the Department of Energy, Savannah River, and for SRMC, is focused on risk reduction. And our focus first and foremost is the high curie material first, because that gets the risk down. Just once again, a curie is a measurement that helps define the level of activity or level of radioactivity, the intensity of it for the liquid that's in the tanks. And so we made it a priority for SRMC when we came on board to say we wanted to process the higher curie material first and get that through the system, because that drives the risk down of what's left in the tanks. The other focus that we had in addition to going after the high curie material is to focus on optimizing and increasing the throughput of the system. Since SWPF has only been online for a few years, when you bring a new plant online and integrate it to the overall series of plants that it's interlaced with, you go through a period of ascension, ramping up, working through issues in the process. And so we have a heavy focus on optimizations and increasing the throughput and the availability of the plants. And so I'll talk to that today. Part of that is optimizing the timing of when NGS is deployed. I know that was a topic that was brought up yesterday. I'm going to speak to that today and where our current thinking is on that and why. And then once again, part of the risk reduction strategy is focusing on getting the high-level waste out of tanks that are the old-style tanks, with a particular emphasis on old-style tanks that are actually in the water table in H tank farm. All right, so this graph is also one that I have shown before, and I brought it up to give you an update just so that you can see. If you look, when we first presented this, we were around 227 curies. Right now in the system, we're somewhere around 217 in the system to date because of the fact we've been driving high curie batches. And if you look, here's a table that shows batches 5 through 19. The high curie batches, the number of actual batches we're going to run is somewhere around 20 to 22 based on the current inventory as we've been re-looking at the high curie batches. But the short story on that is we are anticipating right now with our throughput projections and the optimizations that we're going to do, that we're trying to complete all those batches by the end of fiscal 25. And so you can see by some of the completes here that we're well on our way to moving down that path, and the result of that is that we are increasing the amount of curies that we're going to reduce. This graph goes from July of 22 to right at the end of fiscal year 25. And in that same time period compared to the previous system plan that we inherited as far as SRMC, we're going to reduce almost about 15 to 20% more curies in that same window of time as demonstrated by this graph. So prior to going to a high curie strategy, we were feeding nominally about a half a curie per gallon cesium material into SWPF, half a curie, a little bit more, less than 1, and our plan is shifted to where we're now feeding batches in the 1.3 to 2.5 curies per gallon cesium all the way through FY25. Part of the benefit that you get from that is you also see that the sodium molarity on those batches is typically higher than the nominal 644 molar sodium that we've been feeding the plants, or was a design basis. And the more concentration that we have of salt molarity in every gallon that goes through, think of it as you're getting more bang for your buck. Ultimately, you're going to have to process less volume. You'll finish sooner. So there's a benefit to doing that. So this strategy is working very well. One of the optimizations you'll hear me talk about is once this curie feed material that I'm describing here comes out of a feed tank in the tank farms, when it gets into SWPF, there's some dilution of that material that occurs just due to normal processing, cleaning solutions, other things. And one of the things that we're doing right now is we're ramping up and diluting that material less, which means what we feed solvent extraction is getting more and more concentrated. So we're in an ascension campaign within SWPF related to that. So what's the result of that? If you get to what are we seeing now that we're into the path that I was describing? What we're seeing is we are continuing to drive down risk at an accelerated pace. We're hitting some record production numbers. Matter of fact, you can see right here over the month of March, right before we went into the site steam outage, that we actually had record salt curies that was processed in a month. We processed out of the salt feed alone north of 1 million curies in 1 month, which is significant. And so you can see the slope of the line. You can see the slope of the line here. As we continue to feed higher curie material, you're seeing it starting to even tail up further. So let's give that some perspective. What does that ultimately mean to us? If you look at this timeline, in this timeline, October of 20 was when SWPF came online. And so in the initial 3 years that are shown on this graph, there were some initial thoughts that in that first 3 years, we might see 9 million as we go through the ascension process of working through the issues I was describing in the plants. I would tell you right now that we're currently on path to roughly around 7.6 million gallons by the end of fiscal 23. And you can see that between the difference between the purple dotted line, which is showing the volumetric to 9 million gallons, and the blue dotted line, which is showing to around 7.6. So while the production numbers are slightly lower than what was predicted, what you're seeing with the high curie strategy is the corresponding solid lines that relate to that. The original strategy that we were going to feed, you can see we were between 10 and 11 million curies that would be processed in that time. And with the current strategy that we're doing now with high curie, even though we're doing less gallonage, 7.6 to 9, we're going to be processing close to 17 million curies in that same time window. And so what that is about a 58% increase, that 6 million more curies over that same period of time. And to give you a further comparison, if you look at prior to SWPF coming online, so through the end of right here, 2020, that was probably around 12.5 million curies done in that 7-8 year period. And you can see, since SWPF's been online, that we're already somewhere 9 to 10, right around 9 to 10 million curies. And that's continuing to increase at an increasing rate as we keep feeding the high curie batches in. The ultimate goal of all of that and the results of that is risk reduction is occurring. So now I want to talk about SWPF processing throughput rates as we keep driving the higher curie batches through, and how we continue just to further advance that risk reduction by driving our throughput up as we work through some of these initial issues. The key focus, and this is a graphical representation of all the key processing facilities in liquid waste. You'll notice the red circles drawing your attention to DWPF, Defense Waste Processing Facility, and SWPF, the Salt Waste Processing Facility. This is really the key part of our processing, and it is our most constrained part of our process, has to have the highest availability and the most throughput to ensure that we finish our mission. If you look at some of the other plants like Saltstone, it shows things like 20% availability. ETF's got to have 10 to 25%. The evaporators are 50% or less. But these plants are showing they have to be north of 70% availability, 73, 75% to get the kind of throughput and mission completion that we're looking for. And so here's your first car analogy. When you think about the two things that are important about ultimately getting the mission done, you have to get the availability of the plants up, and you got to get the throughput of the plants up. So if you're driving your car like I am today, availability is it in the shop or is it on the road driving? Quite simply. And relative to the throughput, it's how fast are you driving. I'm going to need both of those, car on the road and a car that will go the speed limit, or something pretty close to that, to get me to Oak Ridge on time today. So it's nothing more complex than that. You can achieve your objectives by increasing either or of those or both of those. If you're having trouble with throughput but your availability is high, you can achieve some good numbers. If your availability is bad, even if your throughput's really high, you're going to have problems. So they're directly related, as you can see. So now I want to talk about some of the optimizations relative to SWPF, and I'm going to try to focus on some of the ones that are kind of more significant, and then I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of the overall plan that we're working. But basically, this is showing a task order 3 period, the 15-month task order that we're executing on that ends at the end of fiscal 23. And so our focus is several-fold. One of the things, back to what I said a minute ago, we are trying to get our process availability up. And so relative to SWPF in particular, Our process availability is we have some solids that are forming that are causing us downtime, particularly with solvent extraction and particularly with the SE coalescer that's part of solvent extraction. So we're seeing it in the contactors and we're seeing it in the SE coalescer. Relative to throughput, right now the filtration, and once again the way SWPF works is the front end of the process is filtration. We filter out the actinides, things like strontium and plutonium. Those go to DWPF to get in the glass. And after it goes through filtration, it goes through solvent extraction where we strip the cesium out. We take the cesium to DWPF and put in the glass. And then the decontaminated salt solution then goes to saltstone, large volume, but decontaminated. And so what happens is while solvent extraction is causing us availability problems, filtration is causing us throughput problems because we're not able to filter as fast as we need to, and we're having to limit solvent extraction's rate because we'll run out of feed if we don't. So a lot of our efforts, which I'll go through a few here in just a second, are related on addressing both pieces of that. And then relative to next-gen solvent or max calyx, we want to deploy that once filtration is no longer limiting, because the new generation solvent helps solvent extraction run better, helps it run faster. And right now, we can't even run it as fast as it can with the current Bob Calyx flow sheet because filtration is limiting. So because of that, we're going to put it in the minute that filtration is now outpacing solvent extraction. And of course, we'll time that. We're actually working on activities right now in the facility to get ready to deploy next-gen solvent and have been working on those for some period of time. But our goal is to get to an ultimate management decision and deploy it at just the right time when it will benefit overall throughput. To put NGS in prematurely just adds another variable when we're working through different issues like the solids formation I was describing. It just adds another variable that we're now trying to figure out, did that cause the problem or do we understand the problem? So that's part of the reason that we're getting ready. We'll be ready to deploy it as soon as it's the right time, but we don't want to deploy it too soon. Now, relative to timing for next-gen solvent, last time I talked to you, I think we said we were going to probably deploy it around the end of fiscal 25 when the high curie batches were done. Our best projections at that time thought that might be the optimum time to do it after we'd resolved some of our issues, got filtration up, and still meet our mission objectives to finish it with the aggressive dates that we're working toward. Our most recent modeling that we've been doing has actually been challenging us on that internally to say we probably are going to have to deploy it in FY24. So most of our efforts right now are to get ready so we can make a management decision in FY24 with a possible deployment in FY24 somewhere around the May timeframe, just to give you a feel for when that would be. But once again, the management decision will drive it. And if we get there and the plant still having some of the issues I was describing, we could get right up to the point and delay it depending on what we're seeing in the plant. The other thing that we're doing here are two things. We're doing engineering actions to overwhelm the problems that we're seeing, and then we're doing chemistry actions to understand the problems. So the first thing I'll talk about is the chemistry actions. And there you see up here where we're doing lots of sampling. So as you heard me talking about solids we're seeing in the SE coalescer, in the contactors as well. We've been sampling those solids, and SRNL's working to give us results back so that we can understand the mechanisms what's causing those solids formation. Hope from that would be if we understand it, there may be ways that we can prevent it within our process, that we can just eliminate those. But in case there are not simple ways to eliminate those, we're putting in lots of improvements to overwhelm those. And those are engineering actions that we're doing to help us just, even though the solids are there, help us to deal with them and keep processing at a fast rate. And I'm going to go through a few of those right now. So the very first thing we did right out of the bat was that we, once SWPF came into the SRMC contract, is that we wanted to improve our integrated operations. And the focus of that is availability. All of our plants that you saw on that graphic earlier work like a bunch of gears that are all intertwined. And if one of those gears stops, it stops all the gears from running. So if SWPF's running well and DWPF's not, there's no place to put the effluent stream from SWPF because it goes to DWPF and it could shut everything down. And the same is true for the other plants that are integrated. So part of what we're doing with that is we improved our integrated operations to make sure that when the plants do have to go down, they all go down and use that time wisely. We keep those outage durations very short and they all come back up together so that they're not They're not working in silos, and one plant goes offline and surprises another plant, and now all of a sudden you're down and you're very inefficient. So we've seen great improvements in how well the teams are all working together, which is helping to keep the availability of all our plants very high. So the next big thing that I'm going to talk through here is that we had cleaning solution that we used when we did filtration cleanings that ended up getting recycled back through the process on the front end, and that was causing even further fouling. And so now we've changed that, and we actually take this stream and it goes to the MST sludge solids tank, which is one of the effluent streams that goes to DWPF, and we process it out to DWPF. That has really helped with our filtration performance since that was initially implemented. And once again, this is a throughput improvement that was ultimately done to help us get more throughput through filtration. The next filtration improvement that we tried is deploying a filter aid. Filter aid is putting some sludge solids material on the front end of the filter that we then drive through with the rest of the process solution to help us filter better. Think of it this way, it's like a filter cake. It helps some very small particles that can plug our filter pores that are small, and it helps them all group together, if you will, into like a filter cake that then helps it to filter better, and it helps us not to plug those filters and lets them run longer before we have to go down to clean those filters. And so we tried the filter aid. We had some mixed results, and so we actually have something on our schedule later on to maybe do a second round of that. But the next thing we moved to after that with some mixed results is we went to reduced MST phase 1. And we did that around the time frame January, I think it was early February. The reduced MST phase 1 took us from the amount of MST that we were adding down to about a fourth of what we were adding previously. So it's a 75% reduction. And once again, we saw good improvement with filtration with that change, and we're continuing to do that even today with good improvements in our filtration. So that also is a throughput improvement, and this was throughput as well. The SE coalescer direct flushing, which I'm going to talk about next, was something done to improve availability. Once again, solvent extraction was going offline because of the solids I was talking about in the contactors and the SE coalescers. And so we'd have to take it offline to clean the SE coalescer, and that could take days to go through that cycle of evolution. And so what we now have is we made mods that we can flush it directly while we're running the process. So we can take a few hours, divert the process stream to a tank and collect it, put an acid flush that's been piped into that coalescer directly on it, restore it, and then continue processing, and we don't have to go down anymore. And so that also is helping with the availability of SWPF overall, because solvent extraction is going down less because of that. And then you can see here, increased sodium processing. This was the Ascension campaign I mentioned on one of the previous slides, with us continuing to increase the sodium molarity on the feed tank. Internal to SWPF, we're continuing to drive up the molarity of what we feed through solvent extraction. And so far, that's been going very well. So once again, a lot of engineered solutions that you see on this graph that are geared around availability improvements and throughput improvements. So this is what we call the Climb to 9 graph that I think we've shared. I know we've shared it before. What this graph shows is that we're on a deliberate plan, if you will. When we took over SWPF's first 1 year of operations, it ran 2 million gallons of salt through the plant. And then it transitioned to SRMC in March of 22. And so we're on this plan. We can finish it outside. Yeah, we're getting to the good stuff now.
Awesome. Well, my key to grab coffee.
Ever say what the first one? Oh, you have an exit door, right?
little sip of water. Excuse me.
Reporters go.
Off. Yeah, he ran.
Oh, yes, he went back to get a drink.
Run.
Yeah.
Few people have stepped out. Thank you. But I think that most of y'all are here. We'll let everybody else settle down. Mike, I think, go ahead, take it away. If we hear another fire alarm, we'll get up, we'll go. When it goes off, we'll come back, and that's what we're going to do.
All right. We can adjust. So once again, this graph is our climb to 9 graph. If you remember back to the availability and throughput graph where I showed you all the liquid waste facilities in the red box around SWPF and DWPF, where both of those plants have to have very high availability in the upper 73, 75%, and they have to have strong throughput. So a lot of our optimizations, even though we're doing them in every plant in liquid waste, but a lot of them are focused on those 2 plants. And this graph has captured some of the more significant ones that we're doing. Both the top half of the line is SWPF optimizations, and the bottom half are DWPF optimizations. And so we're on this climb up to 9 million gallons ultimately, that right now you can see we're in the April-May timeframe here, indicated by the line, and we have climbed from the original first year of ops of 2 million gallons rate to where we're now in the 4.5 million gallon a year rate and continuing to climb our way up as we implement optimization. So I covered a bunch of the optimizations that we've done in SWPF on the last slide. All these green circles are the ones I spoke to on the previous slide, so I'm not going to talk to that here. But you can see those were integral ones to help us get to the rates that we're seeing now. And I'm going to talk about a few just overall and kind of big picture. And then if there are specifics, I can answer any of them, but I don't plan to cover all these just due to time. So I'm going to start with DWPF, because DWPF's mission relative to get SWPF to go to its max rate, and SWPF is our critical path to finishing the mission, the salt waste. DWPF plays a critical role because it takes the effluent streams, the high activity, the high curie streams from SWPF, which are MST sludge solids that come out of filtration, and it takes the strip effluent that comes out of solvent extraction. Those 2 streams come into DWPF, and we have to process those through a vessel. DWPF is a set of series of tanks. There's 3 of them, 3 key ones. The sludge receipt and adjustment tank, where a lot of the processing I'm about to describe goes on. It then goes to the slurry mix evaporator, where we add frit and concentrate it down, and then it goes to a melter feed tank and feeds the melter. If you look at the cycle time of DWPF, the most limiting cycle time by far is the first vessel, the sludge receipt and adjustment tank, which is where all the effluent streams from the MST sludge solids and strip effluent go. And so pretty much most of these optimizations here that you see are geared around one of those dealing with those effluent streams. So the way that you make things go faster is you either reduce the volume of those effluent streams, so you got less to process. You can increase your processing rates in DWPF by doing a bunch of optimizations that you see here that help us to concentrate that down and reduce the volume much faster. And then ultimately, you can do that by several different ways. You can do that through either increasing steam rates or feed rates. But the other way that you can help the system is you can split that effluent stream and don't take it all into the one vessel, the SRAT, but split it to the slurry mix evaporator. Because if you look at the cycle times, the SRAT's the longest, the other vessels are much shorter. And so some of the mods that we're doing here are actually splitting that feed stream so you can take some of the strip effluent to one of the other vessels. So once again, you reduce the volumes, speed at which you process it through, or even split it so that you can process it in multiple vessels or 2 vessels versus 1. And that's what the majority of all of these that you see down here are doing. The last piece that's down here is related to availability, like this one right here, critical spares and crane reliability. This gets back to DWPF's availability so that when you need it to process those effluent streams, it can do it, and it's not shut down for maintenance. So that is a summary, if you will, of everything that's going on in DWPF. And once again, good progress being made. The biggest thing that we've done recently, we've implemented a glycolic flow sheet that lets us do lots of improvements that how we process, how much faster we can process in that facility. So SWPF, and I've covered a bunch of these on the previous slide, but the issues here are related around, once again, can we concentrate the waste down so you send less of it to DWPF? So we've got some initiatives related to the MST sludge solids to reduce that so we don't send as much and we send it less frequently. And so by doing that, that lets us then process more strip effluent through the SRAT. But then we have a lot of other optimizations that we have that are all geared around the things I was talking about earlier, getting filtration up and getting solvent extraction to where it can, in essence, have less downtime for availability so that it can run and keep the plant running longer. And then once filtration is not the limiter, then you'll see us do things like deploy, like I was mentioning a minute ago, NGS out here around May 24 timeframe is our current thinking, that then lets us speed up at what rate that solvent extraction runs. So a lot of data on this graph, lots of optimizations that are occurring. All of the ones that you can see that have green dates on them, which is, at the time I put this slide in, was through March. Now the April ones are done. But those are all done, and we're continuing to march our way up the line, as you can see, tentative dates for items that we're implementing. So the message here is a very deliberate campaign, if you will, of optimizations to work our way from where we are now, which is around a 4.5 million rate, ultimately up to 9, and that 4.5 rate's up from the 2 million from year 1 of operations. Okay. So the message ultimately from this is we are seeing results, but we're continuing to work the plan. And so you see some recent production records. These are our best production records. Our best calendar month ever was the month of March of 23, right before we went down for the site steam outage. We processed 377,000, just north of that. That kind of rate right there, if you sustain that for a year, is around a 4.5 million rate. Our best 7-day volume was the last week of March, you can see here, and we did 146,000 gallons in that week. If you could sustain that for 52 weeks, you're in the 7.6 million gallons. So you can see we're starting to see windows of promise, I'll call it, that we're seeing good weeks, better months, and overall, our overall rates are much higher as we continue to work that climb to 9 path that I was showing you on the last slide. So related further to optimizing when NGS is deployed, as I told you before, we originally thought we'd put it in at the end of all the high curie batches. Our modeling has shown us to get to a plan that finishes our mission in 2037, which is our internal goal that we're working towards, that we have to get to higher throughput before that, and we've been seeing good promise with filtration. And so what this is reflecting that in 25, we need to be running at a rate that we need NGS to do, and filtration has to support it as well. So what we are currently planning, like you saw in the last graphic that I highlighted, is that we're going to, right now, we think we'll deploy in 24. That's when our management decision is, hence why the production's a little lower while we're doing that, even though we're climbing. And once again, the goal is still the same. Once filtration is no longer limiting, we'll deploy it, because what it does is it lets us get up to these 9 million gallon a year rates overall, which we need to do, and it's where we're headed. So that's kind of the Curie risk reduction, optimization of SWPF, how it ties in together. One thing, once again, back to car analogies, because I don't think I mentioned it earlier, but I did back in November. Our throughput ultimately is driving how many gallons we're pushing through the system. High curie strategy then is a measure of how effective we're being at getting the risk reduced in those gallons. So think of it like miles per gallon is what I used before. You got miles, you can put in so much gas in your car, and depending on your miles per gallon determines how much further you can go. And that's the same strategy we're doing with higher curies while we drive up throughput as well. All right, so now the last topic I was going to just give an update on that we talked about previously, that risk reduction is twofold. It's getting high curie material out of the tanks first. It's increasing the throughput through SWPF, DWPF, but it's also targeting old style tanks, particularly ones that are in places like the water table, like the ones in H Tank Farm. And so when we came on board, the schedule at the top was the schedule. We had ticker deployed in this area, if you remember, and the schedule for finishing, getting through all the waste removal and feed. You can see the time frame that we were going to work our way through and get into the final closure process and ultimately close the tanks out here. And we're looking all the way out to the 31 time frame. And what we did when we paused ticker is we've been aggressively putting waste removal pumps in those tanks and installing hose and hose transfer lines and getting things set up so that we can get this waste out of those 3 tanks as fast as possible and pump it up to feed tanks for SWPF. Now that we have a plant that is able to process salt waste much faster, we're getting it out, instead of taking this feed through ticker, which is much slower, we're putting it up in front of SWPF, and we're aggressively working to that end. And what the schedule that we're on currently is that sometime in mid to late summer, probably late summer, we're going to be doing waste removal activities in these tanks, and we've accelerated the closure of these tanks by about 4 years in that strategy. So very heavy emphasis here. You see terms like critical chain approach. When you do scheduling and project management, a lot of times people will lay schedules out that have a little bit of float and contingency in all their activities, and they lay out a schedule. With these tanks, we've challenged our team to use critical chain, which means there is no contingency or float in the individual activities. It's all managed at the senior level at the end. So if an engineer needs a week to do an activity, or he says he needs a week, we ask him, how long does it really take to approve that design? He says it's a day. He gets a day. He doesn't get a week and know that as long as he's done in a week, he's fine. But we'll manage the float and contingency at the back end of the project. So getting the team recalibrated to this, it's not bad. If you end up missing, if it's a day and it takes you a day and a half, that's still better than telling us it's going to take you a week and you take a week. So that's part of that critical chain approach is what we're employing on these tanks to help drive them faster, and it's working. So in summary, we're focusing on processing higher curie batches at SWPF. It is already showing results with risk reduction and is on the same path that we described back in November of 22. We have a well-defined strategy for accelerating our throughput of SWPF, our Climb to 9, which helps us address the availability of the plants, and also the throughput. Relative to NGS, once again, even though I told you before we thought it could be as late as the end of 25, our current thinking is it's going to probably be deployed in 24. But once again, we will have a management decision, and we will watch how everything's progressing and make a final call when we get there. But we're doing all of the activities to get ready that we can deploy in 24, as I described. And we're continuing to work very hard to accelerate waste removal and closure of tanks 9 through 11. And with that, I'll open it for questions.
We'll start down here with Donald. Yes, sir. Oh, can we get you a microphone, please?
On slide 11, you show solids and HG sample analysis. HG is mercury, right?
Oh, mercury, yes, sir.
What are we using mercury for?
We use mercury in the canyon as part of the dissolution of the material. It's part of the dissolution process of some of the canyon processes in the past, and so there's mercury in our waste tanks that we're dealing with. So the solids, the early results that we're seeing is that mercury and titanium and some of the other heavy metals are some of the problems that may be causing some of our solids formation, but this is very early data. We're looking at that data, trying to figure out what's going on. But yes, HG is mercury.
Okay.
Okay.
We'll come all the way around. Sade?
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I was curious, is there like a roadmap for the entire liquid waste program? So that you kind of went into detail for the sludge batches, but like, is there a roadmap for the other items as far as completion?
So you mean overall for the roadmap, just for finishing the mission completely?
Yes, and as far as like for processing the salt batches, kind of seen a more detailed roadmap for like the tank closures, but the canisters, for all the items on slide 5.
Yes, so our roadmap would be our system plan. We issue a system plan usually annually. We just approved System Plan Rev 23, which is very near term to being released. We're working through the approval process to get it released. But it has the roadmap. You'll hear us use terms like DNA chart that kind of shows the flow of all the salt and sludge batches to get to mission completion. When you heard me talking about our internal aggressive plan of 2037, it would reflect that. So it shows all the sludge batches. It shows the canister rates, the salt rates, some of which I'm talking here. It also talks about what has to occur in the system to be successful, and a lot of these optimizations are described in that system plan. That shows the plan that we're on, a deliberate plan to implement those to achieve it. So, okay?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Greg?
Greg Murray, CAB, thank you so much for the presentation. I thought it was very informative. I want to ask you about this critical chain approach. And you're talking about how it accelerates things, and you're giving an example of a project or a task that previously they'd been given, some engineer had been given a week to do, and you changed it to a day, and that sort of thing. So I guess I have a couple of questions on this. First, I'm assuming you're not implying that that engineer was just sitting around for those extra 5 days previously.
No, not at all. I'm an engineer by degree, just so you know. And it's like, so what happens when you have a facility, or in this situation, all of liquid waste, and they're managing lots of different schedules, that engineer may have 20, 30 things he has to do this week. So as he's managing different project schedules, deliverables that he has to do, he has to have some contingency so that he can manage his deliverables. So that's why typically they go in with what I'll call kind of a reasonable, normal type duration for those activities. That way he can juggle between those and make sure he's supporting all of his customers. With critical chain, when you do employ critical chain, you can't do it across your whole project because you can't take that flexibility for people to manage their work away, but you can apply it to a few things that are very, very important. In the past, when we've done it, are things like when we get into a melter changeout. When the melter fails in DWPF, all of liquid waste shuts down. And so we treat things that are super critical like that, like critical chain. It means that is first above everything else. We want to know exactly how long it takes you to do it. And as soon as you're done with your activity, you finish it. And then you go back to all the other, I'll call it more normal project management schedule, where he has contingency on all of his tasks. So you can't do it everywhere or it doesn't work. But when you have a few things that are super critical, like this, it is very effective in driving this schedule faster.
So to some degree, what you're doing is saying no multitasking.
That's what it says is out of his multitask list of items, when this hits his desk, he stops what he's doing and does this, passes his part on, passes his baton on, if you will, and then he goes back to his other activities.
Because that process is accelerated, does that mean that any of the safety checks and such are reduced?
No, all the same levels of safety checks, the redundancies, like when you have to have second person reviews, the level of his review is not being shortened. We're not asking the person to do their review faster. We're just saying when that activity hits your desk, don't let it sit on your desk for a few days before you do your work. Pause the other things and work on this activity. So everything is exactly the same. The amount of effort they apply, the number of redundant checks that are done, none of that changes.
I would think this would be fairly disruptive in their process. Is there a management overview process determining what tasks fall under critical chain?
Yeah, the only ones we're currently deploying it on right now is tanks 9 through 11. And we keep it to a very small group for that reason.
Okay.
Like I said, in the past, we've used it on things like melter changeout. This is a case we're using it. We use it on construction of an SDU project because that is a separate team, that is a dedicated team. So it works very well there as well.
Is there anything else y'all are thinking about doing with critical chain?
No, not currently.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure.
Charles?
Mike, this was a wonderful presentation. You'd go to one slide, I'd raise 4 questions in my mind, and then the next slide would answer them. So you've really done a good job with this presentation.
Thanks, Joe.
When I look at slide 7, and you don't need to pull it,
I'll pull it.
but you're going, curies per gallon is going from somewhere around 0.5 to up to possibly 2.5, a 5-time increase. And at the same time, I'm looking at slide 14, where you're going to increase the throughput, roughly doubling. That's almost inconceivable that you're going to concentrate this stuff that much and continue increasing the throughput without stopping up something. And that's what y'all are doing with all of this you're telling me, trying to implement that.
Yeah, so what you have to be very careful with is as we're driving the molarity up here, where you can see the molarity is going up north of 644, which is kind of like the design basis nominal case. We have testing that's been done in development, both in ARPMCU and also SWPF in the early days, that we know we can go higher. We know we can go north of right around 7 and even north of 7 for what gets fed into solvent extraction. So this molarity gets diluted internal to SWPF before it goes through solvent extraction. So we're very deliberate as we ramp that up. If you go back even, if you look right here where it talks about, somewhere on here is ascension. I'm not seeing it right now, but it's on. I'll keep looking. But what we're doing is the dilution that we do in SWPF, we are raising the molarity internal to SWPF and diluting it less before it goes through solvent extraction. And we're doing that very deliberate because we want to make sure we don't cause a solids formation problem. So solids can form if the sodium molarity gets too high, if your temperature or your process flow streams aren't set just right. So you have to be very deliberate as you start to ramp up internals of the plant, that you're monitoring your parameters well and you're controlling your temperatures well and your feed rates well, so that you can ramp it up and get the benefit without having further solids. So we've already increased that and started that campaign a couple of months ago, and it's working very well. We have seen no problems, and past testing would tell us, as long as we pay attention to the things that we're paying attention to in the plant, that we should be able to bring it up. So
This leads to the question for me is, the glass plant has been around forever. And, it's worked perfectly, and it's old school now. With you ramping to 8.5, 9 million this quickly, are they going to be able to handle it?
yeah, they will, because what the end result, and I'll start with by saying if DWP's been around forever, that means I've been around forever, because I helped start that up when I was a young pup. So now you're making me feel very old. But the main thing that happens as we ramp up SWPF is they get more volume of strip and more volume of MST sludge solids that the SRAT has to work off. The chemistry of what comes into DWPF is still within our, what we call our waste acceptance criteria. We have boxes that we operate in process-wise. Most chemical plants, as you know, do. And so we're well within our boxes of doing that. And any of the changes that we do, we always evaluate against that and make sure that we're in a good region, if you will, for processing. So it's obviously a lot more involved answer than I'm giving, but overall, we're meeting the waste acceptance criteria. We're evaluating it against that. The biggest change is more volume as we run harder and faster. And we're doing even optimizations to, even though we're running harder and faster, to still make the volumes less. One of these optimizations, instead of sending 2,800 gallons of MST sludge solids every 7 days, we're trying to send that kind of volume every 60 days because there's some changes in how we wash it that we can reduce that volume. And by doing that, it helps us process stuff through. So there's things up here to even help compress that volume. So,
Thank you. That was an excellent presentation.
thank you.
Okay. Sade, did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I'm curious about what are the conditions when processing is at a record high, and why aren't you all able to maintain those levels of optimization consistently?
So I'm sorry, I'm not sure I caught that. If you could repeat, please.
Okay, I'm curious about what were the conditions when you've achieved record high levels of processing?
Okay, gotcha. So if you go back, a lot of it was related to these items that I was describing here. These were some of the more significant ones since this one right here helps with filtration improvement. This helped with filtration improvement. This particularly helped with filtration improvement. The suite of those helped get the throughput on filtration up, which let us push more through SWPF. So those are probably some of the more significant ones. The other one I would mention is, as I talked before, this lets us not have to take solvent extraction down as much, so the availability on the plant's higher, because we flush the coalescer online most of the time. We don't shut down to clean like we were doing early on. And so that's been very helpful as well. But these are some of the ones from this big list that have been very helpful, and there's some others on here that also contributed. But everything that we've done prior to this May window right here, all of these improvements, those ultimately are what are helping us get the kind of numbers we're seeing today.
All right, thank you. Are you going to continue those improvements so that you're able to remain at the same level of optimization?
Yes, ma'am, that is exactly right. The only one that we're not doing right now, this item here on a filter aid, that had mixed results. So right now we're currently not doing that one. We do have an activity later on that we're going to reevaluate if we want to do that again further. But right now the thoughts are we probably aren't going to need that for the rates that we're getting from some of the other improvements. But all these other improvements that you see here up through May, we're continuing to do. Okay.
Thank you. I'm also curious, is the average closure for 3 tanks, 4 years? Every 4 years you close up to 3 tanks?
No, it doesn't quite work in a linear fashion because a lot of things are dependent on it. One thing is funding, like to grout the tanks. We're putting all the focus of the funding dollars on the risk reduction, the waste removal from the tanks. So if we get to the next dollar spent and it's go grout a tank that's empty where the risk has been removed, or it's go get a tank ready to pull more waste out and reduce the risk, we're focusing on the risk reduction. With the dollars that we have that are in excess of being able to support the plants running at a full rate, we start grouting tanks. So sometimes we'll empty a tank and let it delay a little bit before we grout it. How that would work. The other thing is the throughput on the plants. We have several of our tanks that are outfitted right now to dissolve salt and start to get the waste ready for salt batches, but the plants aren't running fast enough to where some of those tanks are sitting waiting for volume to open up, free space, so we can make up salt batches to send to the processing plant. So as we continue to ramp up the throughput of the plants, that then starts happening faster. These tanks that are outfitted can start dissolving and making up salt batches. So,
Thank you.
you're welcome.
Okay. We'll come across to Jim.
Let's go, here we go. Okay. This, obviously, you've done a lot of work in modeling the whole process.
Yes.
Does your model give you an opportunity to see at end stage, when we're finished with the mission as we know it today, how much capacity of the SDU tanks would remain?
Yes, it does. Very good question. So this is the throughput of the volumes, and all this volumes that's shown here at this rate, then with the volume of inventory that we have, we are predicting that the last SDU, which is 12, is somewhere around half full when we're done. Now, different things we do in processing can change what that waste stream is, that the DSS waste stream that then could eat up more of that space. But right now our projection is about half to 2/3 full on 12, and then when the mission's done.
Okay, assume that's a place you'd like to be.
Oh, yes, we don't want to build a 13th SDU. That's right. If we start, and we have, when we do see challenges in our DSS ratio, the decontaminated salt solution ratio starts climbing, and we've been seeing a little bit of that recently with some of the optimization, as we're working through things. We pay a lot of attention to that, and we then deploy optimizations to try to keep that in the proper range to make sure we never our headlights don't get beyond SDU 12. Too much money, we're going to make sure we finish in 12.
Thank you.
And we'll go back over to Steve.
Steve Riley, CAB. And slide 4, well, actually, that slide right there. So you've got some lower productions in FY 28, 29. Clearly, that's for some expected downtime. I'm just curious what you're expecting in those years that bring you down.
FY 29 is a melter change out. So we have melter forecast left usually about a half a year of downtime, and 28 might have been I think it's the tail end of 28 and the first part of 29 is when that change out is.
Thanks.
Anything else from around the table? Mike, thank you.
Okay, thank y'all.
Up next, we have Susan Fulmer with DHEC for an overview of their program.
Well, good morning. I'm Susan Fulmer with the South Carolina Department of Health and Environmental Control, and I am the Federal Facility Agreement Manager for the state of South Carolina. I also manage the federal remediation section at DHEC, and this is the group that oversees the federal lead Superfund cleanups. So those are National Priority List or NPL sites. And of course, Savannah River site is one of the NPL sites in South Carolina. It is by far our largest NPL site. Today, I'm going to talk about a lot of the things that we do at DHEC, not just the Superfund program. So let's get started. Our vision is healthy people living in healthy communities, and we work toward our vision through our mission to improve the quality of life for all South Carolinians by protecting and promoting the health of the public and the environment. So as I've mentioned before, we are a health and environmental agency currently. We are one of a handful of agencies in the country that combines health and environmental agencies in one department. As I mentioned yesterday, that may no longer be the case after next year. But currently, we're structured with Public Health Division, Health Regulations, Environmental Affairs, and then Operations, which supports all of the other divisions. I'm going to focus on Environmental Affairs because that's where our oversight of Savannah River site is. Okay, so everybody likes Dr. Seuss, right? My favorite Dr. Seuss character is the Lorax, and I like to think that Environmental Affairs is a little bit like the Lorax, okay? But instead of speaking for the trees, we speak for the air, the water, and the land. And we do that through our Bureau of Air Quality, Bureau of Water, Bureau of Land and Waste Management, Bureau of Environmental Health Services, which is our district offices, and the Office of Ocean and Coastal Resource Management, or OCRM. So with the exception of OCRM, all of these other bureaus interact with the Savannah River site. Unfortunately, SRS is not on the coast, so OCRM doesn't get to play. DHEC's environmental roles cover 4 areas. We work towards protection of the environment, oversight of activities at the site, emergency preparedness, and improvement through our cleanup programs. So before I go through each of those areas, I just want to remind you of some things that we do not do at DHEC. We do not regulate the storage of spent nuclear fuel or nuclear materials. Okay, so what do we do then? All right, I'll start with protection programs. So we have environmental permits, and those permits allow for us to allow the Savannah River site to conduct activities, but they have to be consistent with federal and state laws and regulations. EPA has delegated authority to the state for a variety of programs in our air, water, waste, and cleanup programs. So we issue permits in accordance with federal and state laws and requirements. We will inspect Savannah River site to ensure that they are complying with their permit requirements, and we can take enforcement action against the site if and when it's necessary. So here are some of the protection programs that we have. We have a variety of programs within our Bureau of Water, which are these programs on the side of the slide. Mr. Budney mentioned the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System this morning, the NPDES permit. There is a permit for the site to discharge effluents from a variety of sources. Those could be processed water, could be discharged, wastewater, under the NPDES permit, cooling water, groundwater effluent is under the NPDES permit. And so there are requirements, discharge pollutant limits set under the NPDES permit, and monitoring requirements. So what he was speaking to earlier was a monitoring requirement that had been missed. We also have programs in our Bureau of Air Quality. There's my slide. There's a Title V air permit that is handled by Bureau of Air Quality. There are also permits in the Bureau of Air for the surplus plutonium disposition project and the Defense Waste Processing Facility. They would also cover any asbestos permits that are needed. If, say, a building is being taken down and asbestos is part of that building, that would be handled by Bureau of Air. The hazardous waste permit is part of the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, or RCRA. That's a program in our Bureau of Land and Waste Management. Radioactive waste transportation is handled by our emergency response group. We have landfill permits and our solid waste permits that are handled throughout the site. So for instance, D area, the ash project that was conducted a few years ago, our solid waste folks were involved in the ash landfill there. Also the saltstone disposal facility, which is part of the liquid waste system that Mike was just talking about. There's a Class 3 landfill permit for the saltstone disposal facility that is handled by solid waste. If there were underground storage tanks or are underground storage tanks at the site, so think of a gas station that has underground tanks for fueling, that's handled by our UST division. And then lab certification is part of our Bureau of Environmental Health Services. So another role for DHEC is our oversight role. We monitor the site for compliance with those permits that I just talked about, but we also have a special program that oversees the site, and that is our Environmental Surveillance and Oversight Program, or ESOP. So through that program, we have staff in our regional office that goes out and takes samples from Savannah Riverside and the surrounding areas to determine if there's been any impact from SRS activities to the community. So they're taking samples of air and water, soil, sediment, vegetation, milk, fish, and game animals. They take those samples yearly, so right now they're taking samples in 2023. They will take some time to get the samples analyzed, review the results, and then write a report. So right now we're working on the report for all of the 2022 data that was collected. So the most recent report that is available right now is the 2021 report, which is the picture that's on the slide. You can access it at the URL that's at the bottom of the slide. And we have not only the 2021 report available online on our website, but we also have older reports as well if you're interested in reviewing those. So as I mentioned, this work is conducted by the regional office. They maintain a presence at the site, not just through the ESOP program, but they're also out there conducting inspections as part of the permitting programs. And we also have staff who are overseeing the cleanup work, cleanup activities that are being conducted on site. So they're a frequent presence on site, and we greatly appreciate all the work that the regional office does to keep us informed. Another role that DHEC has is emergency preparedness. So in general, South Carolina has a comprehensive emergency operations plan for disasters within the state. So whether that's a man-made disaster like terrorism or natural disasters like hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, we have an emergency operations plan in place. But because of the special nature of Savannah Riverside, we have some extra measures that we take in order to be prepared should an emergency arise at the site. That's handled by our emergency response division. They hold practice drills that are specifically geared toward the site so that they're prepared in the event of any emergency. All right, so now I want to talk about the final area of environmental affairs, and that's improvement. So we are working to improve the quality of life for all South Carolinians through health in the environment, and we do that through our cleanup programs. We have, as I mentioned, a hazardous waste permit, which is under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, or RCRA. It requires assessment of all the cleanup of all waste contaminated areas at Savannah Riverside, and that includes some of the major areas like F and H, M, Mixed Waste Management Facility. This is a photo of the F area base injection system. This is for groundwater treatment. We also have a cleanup program through the Federal Facility Agreement, or FFA, and this is mainly our Superfund program, okay, that I mentioned that I manage. And the Federal Facility Agreement takes the RCRA requirements and the CERCLA requirements, and it marries that process so that the documents that we're reviewing will satisfy RCRA and CERCLA. Federal Facility Agreement is a three-party agreement, and that's DOE, EPA, and DHEC. They're the three parties to the agreement. It is a document required by CERCLA for federal facilities, but it is, they can vary between sites. So for instance, Savannah River Site's FFA is different than an FFA that you would see for Hanford or that you would see for a Department of Defense facility. And so it's an agreement that's negotiated between the three parties, and it's going to have site-specific information dealt within it. For instance, we have the high-level waste tanks. So we have a section that addresses the high-level waste tanks within our FFA. So another facility like Oak Ridge doesn't have that, so they don't have high-level waste tanks in their FFA. So as I mentioned, this is a process that combines the corrective measures studies and of RCRA and CERCLA and combines it into one document. Okay, so there are some differences between the RCRA hazardous waste permit and the FFA. The RCRA permit is a defined regulatory mechanism. The FFA is an agreement, as I mentioned, that is negotiated between the parties. If there is a violation of the RCRA permit, it would go through enforcement. If there is a disagreement for the FFA, it would go through dispute resolution process. So luckily for us, we have not had a lot of disputes at Savannah River Site, and that's because we use the core team approach to do our work. Core team approach is a well-established approach that we've been using for a number of years. It is a formal consensus-based approach to decision-making. We communicate. We talk about problems early on in the process and throughout the process of scoping documents. We agree on what the solution to the problems is, and then we document the solution in our scoping documents. So we communicate, agree, and document before we are writing documents. So that avoids the back and forth of DOE sends us a document and we look at it and say, oh no, I don't agree with that. We've talked about a lot of the issues before we get the document. So a lot of the big things that would be showstoppers have been resolved before we see the document. This is not to say we don't have comments on documents, because we do, but this avoids a lot of downtime. It helps the projects progress much more quickly and more efficiently, and it gets a lot of work done at the site. Okay, so another area where we work towards improvement is through the cleanup of legacy waste, and that's through the site treatment plan. The site treatment plan was enabled by the Federal Facility Compliance Act in 1992, and it requires the Department of Energy to devise a plan for treatment capacities and technologies to treat legacy waste by an approved schedule, and this is enforced by a consent order. So the site treatment plan was developed and approved in consultation with the EPA and other states that were affected by the plan. It covers mixed low-level, transuranic, and high-level waste, and it requires that the state approve any hazardous radioactive waste shipment that's proposed to Savannah River Site. So this consent order was approved in 1998. It's been amended a couple times, 2002 and 2003, and that covers our legacy waste at the site. Now I want to talk about the high-level waste. So Section 3116 of the National Defense Authorization Act is what allows DOE to, in consultation with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, to determine that certain radioactive waste resulting from reprocessing of spent nuclear fuel is not high-level waste. So any residuals that are remaining at the site must be under a state-approved closure plan or state-issued permit. So this is where our high-level waste tank permit comes into play. That is, the high-level waste tank permits are written through our Bureau of Water Industrial Wastewater Program. They are operated through a wastewater permit, and then closure is conducted through wastewater closure modules. We have a consolidated general closure plan that covers the F and H area tank farms, and then there are tank-specific closure modules for each tank as they are closed out. So as Mike showed you, the list of tanks, one by one, we'll develop a tank closure module for tank 9 as that one closes out in tank 10. So the closure modules are, as I said, tank-specific. They describe operational closure activities. DHEC is going to approve all activities that are associated with waste removal, stabilization, and closure of the tanks. Once a tank is closed out from the wastewater permit, then it will be handled under the Superfund CERCLA program that is under the FFA. There are milestones in the federal facility agreement for preliminary cease waste removal from the tanks, so that's removing waste out of the tanks, and operational closure, that's grouting up the tanks. And so that's the, Mike alluded to that schedule. This is for the non-compliant tanks. There are 16 of those still in place. A couple of those are the tanks that are in the water table that he mentioned, where we want to get those accelerated and reduce that risk. So as those tanks are removed are closed out and grouted, they are removed from the permit, they go into the FFA, and we follow the CERCLA process to close them out. There'll be decision documents that are produced. So these are things like the record of decision that you see. There'll be a proposed plan that is provided to the public that discusses the proposed remedial decision. And anything else is addressed through the FFA process. So again, as Mike mentioned this morning, he showed you the liquid waste system with SWPF and DWPF and saltstone disposal facility. As that waste is removed and treated, the low activity waste that comes out of the salt waste processing facility goes to saltstone disposal facility, and then is going to be grouted in the saltstone disposal units, which are under our Class 3 landfill and our solid waste program. Okay, so DHEC is committed to maintaining our inspections and compliance of permits, the cleanup momentum that we have in our RECRA and CERCLA cleanup programs, our emergency preparedness and oversight through the ESOP program. We'll continue to focus on these activities, and in particular, the high-level waste treatment and tank closure activities, work with DOE on site cleanup and waste disposition of the legacy waste as we move forward in our efforts to protect human health and the environment. So I'll stop here for questions, but before I take questions, I just want to point out a couple of folks who are in the room in case you aren't familiar. Greg O'Quinn, raise your hand, Greg. He's at our regional office, and Heather Cathcart, she's our technical coordinator for the Federal Facility Agreement Program. And these folks are, always at the CAB meetings as well as I am, and so we're happy to help you and answer questions anytime you have it, not just today. So with that, questions on the presentation?
We'll start with Narinder.
Thank you, Susan. My question is very simple. You talked that DHEC has authority over wetlands. I was under the impression that wetlands are controlled by Corps of Engineers.
On wetlands, we do have a small section that handles wetlands at SRS.
Okay.
But Army Corps, you're correct, Army Corps does have a role in...
And how about navigation waters?
Again, we also have some navigable waters. I'm not real familiar with all of the work that they do with regards to SRS, but there are some navigable waters.
Thank you.
Sure.
We'll go to Hubert and then Sade. So.
Thank you. Hubert Von Tool, CAB. Susan, thank you for your excellent presentation. You mentioned earlier in your presentation about the authority delegated by the EPA, and of course you discussed extensively the FFA and mentioned some other federal laws. I'm assuming that essentially your authority and jurisdiction within SRS is dependent on what the federal government will delegate to your agency.
So we do have the delegation of those programs. We also have authority with the tanks, which is under the wastewater permit, but also there's a section in our FFA which is carved out for DHEC authority for that.
Okay, thank you.
Sade?
Hi, Susan. Thank you again for the presentation. I was curious if you do anything for, as far as any protections or investigations of like the effect of the plant on pollinators?
So we have looked at trying to enhance pollinator habitat through the various cleanups that we have. A lot of times waste units are capped in place. And so we've looked at maybe trying to enhance pollinator habitat in maintaining that cap. We have to be careful because we can't let trees grow up, for instance, on top of a capped landfill, because that could compromise the integrity of the landfill. And so there's mowing that's conducted, but there's some opportunity to try to enhance pollinator habitat. We don't have a specific program that regulates or investigates pollinator habitat in general within DHEC, but it's something that we do consider when we're developing cleanup activities at the site.
Thank you.
Okay. John, is that yours?
Yeah, John Thomas, CAB. What was the RCRA again?
That's the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. That's the hazardous waste permit for the site.
Okay. And the other question I had was on the taking of the samples. Does taking of the samples, does that address all of the different permits so that you're checking for the asbestos and all the different permits that exist?
We're not taking asbestos samples as part of the ESOP program, but they are taking air samples, and so that would satisfy any of the, that would answer questions regarding the permits that Bureau of Air has, like the Title V permit.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Candace?
Candace Cave, CAB. So other than the ESOP, how else is this information shared with the general public?
Okay, so when we're moving a cleanup site through the process, we have opportunities for public comment on remedial decisions. For instance, the proposed plan is one point where we'll take public input into the decision-making process. There are also opportunities for public comment when a permit is up for renewal. So for instance, the RECRA permit, when that one has updates to it, there'll be notices to the public that there's a proposed change to that permit.
So I guess when I say the general public, because a lot of times the people who partake in those types of things are a very specific group of people. So do you notify in any other way to the general public?
The site handles notification through the environmental bulletins.
Mm-hmm.
We do maintain a website or a couple pages on our website that are geared toward SRS. So I encourage you to go online and check us out. We have pages that talk about the federal facility agreement, we talk about our RECRA permit, talk about the air permits. I mean, all of those are laid out specific to Savannah River site for the public, and we hope that people will visit it, and there's some links to contact information to the specific program areas. If people have questions, they can follow up.
Okay, my other question was about the drills. Is the public notified when the drills are being conducted or afterwards? And does the immediate surrounding area, are they participants in these drills in any way?
I'm not real familiar with the specifics of how the drills are handled. I don't believe that there is notification unless there was something maybe that would affect off-site. I think these are on-site drills that they're conducted.
My concern is that sometimes as a member of the general public, because we don't know these things are happening, we assume they're not.
Sure. I'll follow up on that and find out exactly what kind of notification they do for that, if any.
Thank you.
It's just a comment. I'm following you now on Instagram, but perhaps other yeah, so perhaps updates there might work.
Greg, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yes, Greg O'Quinn, South Carolina DHEC. Just wanted to follow up on the question that John had. As far as ESOP's concerned, the samples that we collect, and we collect multimedia samples. I just wanted to clarify, those are non-regulatory samples. And so essentially, we collect these samples to kind of compare our results to what SRS is reporting in their ACER on an annual basis. I know we gave a presentation earlier this year on that program. I just wanted to kind of clarify that those samples are non-regulatory samples and aren't really permit-driven.
Thank you. Carolyn? Can we use the microphone? I'm sorry.
How often does monitoring occurs?
For the ESOP program? Mm-hmm. Okay, I'll let Greg answer that question.
Greg O'Quinn, South Carolina DHEC. So we sample throughout the year, and depending on the media, we may do quarterly samples, we may do weekly samples, we may do annual samples. So there's a different frequency for each sample that we collect. That makes sense. So we're out there on a regular basis. For example, surface water we collect weekly. Air samples we collect weekly as well. But there's some media that we only collect once or twice a year.
Okay. So are drills, is that the same as monitoring, or is that two different?
So the drills are separate, and we have a program that kind of participates in those drills just to provide.
Because I don't understand the drills. Can you explain that a little bit?
So the drills are kind of in response, I guess, if there is to prepare our team in case there is an event on site, and also associated, I think, with some of the other facilities around the state. It's a statewide program, but then SRS is part of that as well. And so we just have these drills periodically just to stay prepared in case there is an incident. Now, SRS is different from some of the other reactor areas in the state. So those are the drills that we participate.
Yeah, we could probably use Jim to take a note to brief the CAB on our drill program, because it's pretty extensive. It goes from individuals within one facility to site-wide drills we run for all manner, from security to, active shooter to environmental or nuclear kind of events. So we have a pretty extensive process we go through.
Thank you.
I just want to add to what Greg was saying about the monitoring. So the ESOP program does monitoring of the site, to ensure that the activities don't affect the community. But there's also sampling that's conducted by DOE's contractor to determine what the waste units are that are in place as part of the CIRCLA and the RECRA processes. So samples are collected, and those are various frequencies. They could be quarterly, they could be annually, depending on the unit. So we also have that data available.
Okay. Donald?
Don Colson, CAP. I was just pondering the movement of materials from, described as old tanks in the groundwater table to new tanks. Any of the old tanks leaked?
Yes, there are leak sites in some of the old tanks, old style tanks. They do not keep the level of salt solution above the leak sites. So they lower it below a known leak site to ensure that none of the liquid in the tank is released out into the environment.
How are the newer tanks constructed differently? And what's the risk in transferring material from the old tank to the new one?
So the plan is to not just take the tanks and transfer it from the old tank to a new tank. It's to get it out and treated through salt waste processing and then vitrified in the glass logs or disposed at saltstone disposal facility. But I think I would probably let someone from DOE talk about the differences between the old style and new style tanks.
Yeah, sure. They all have some sort of annulus around them, so you got the tank in the center and some kind of saucer around the outside, and they have different heights on them. So older style tanks have lower ones, newer ones have higher ones. So when we say a tank leaks, it leaks into that annulus, the material doesn't get in the environment. We can pump it from the annulus back into the tank. We lower the water in the tank leak site, keep stuff from getting in the environment. But that is why, the ones that sit in the water table, we got to get them emptied. That's why, as Mike said, we're concentrating on those tanks to get them down, or that's not an issue. But yeah, it's not a leak into the environment.
Okay. Candace, did you have, nope. Sade, did you have anything else? Okay. Anything else around the table? Susan, thank you so much. All right, folks. Rather than hop into the next one, let's take a minute, stretch our legs. Let's take about 15 minutes, 10:45, so we'll just start John right on time, right on schedule, okay? 10:45, please. John, whenever you're ready, let's go.
All right. I'm glad Susan went first. I actually requested that because I'm always going first. I don't know. And some of you know Rob Pope. He did this same talk for his probably 15 years or plus. So we're asked to do this once a year. Obviously, there's a lot of new people, and so some of you have heard it many times. Hopefully, won't get too monotonous. But like Susan, I am the EPA side of the FFA, or lead project manager, Savannah River, like Brian Hennessy, our DOE counterpart. Again, so what I'm going to go through is what is EPA role at Savannah River, explain a little about CERCLA Superfund, how we implement that at Savannah River, and then I have a site example at the end, which I haven't given that before, which might give you a little example of how we actually apply it. And Susan went through a little bit of that, talking about how we do the core team approach. So again, this is how we're working with Department of Energy. Again, Department of Energy, being a federal facilities, I'll touch on that later, is the lead agency, unlike a private site superfund where it might be EPA might be the lead, or a company unless they're bankrupt. Our team sometimes changes from time to time. We've had some people rotate off because they're busy with other sites or retire. Rob Pope has just been on the big detail in headquarters, and again, a lot of his duties, he's still my mentor, and a lot of things we do at Savannah River. He was heavily involved in the tank agreement last year. Deidre Lloyd does the D area. Janet Dawson, who's one, I think some of you know, was one of our contractors for years. She's now taken over from Rob as our lead for the tanks and F&H area. Angela Miller, she's been replaced now. We'll probably get a new one, but we don't usually need these like a normal private Superfund site would, or that help set up public meetings. Obviously with DOE, they have your own public meetings here. Anyway, they help us get involved when we do some of our EJ public meetings and the treat workshops as well. And again, we have people behind us that are technical support, which is actually the group I used to be in until 2010, and now do project manager in that too. So we have a new risk assessor that helped recently with updating the exposure factor handbook. Our actually new attorney came actually from the Coast Guard in New Orleans, so he's come in, has already been busy with a lot of our big decision documents. And again, Tech Law, that's been very consistent, and we were very lucky to keep them through the latest contract change, I think about maybe 3 or 4 years ago. So we've had some of the same people there, and again, that Jen used to be on, and other people that have hydro expert that have worked a long time on Savannah River projects, sometimes longer than us project managers. So again, to try to go through a little bit about EPA, Superfund, how we do that at Savannah River. Again, EPA started under Nixon, 1970. We don't write the environmental laws like Clean Act, Clean Water Act. That's what Congress does. But obviously, we have to write the regulations to implement those laws. We have to enforce those regulations and then set national standards. And so most of you are familiar that most federal agencies, obviously DOE set up different with their field sites, are set up in 10 regions, whether it be like labor, education, place like that, with our headquarters in DC. And again, Region 4 is one of the bigger regions, and especially in the Superfund program, because obviously you can see all the coastline. So obviously we have a lot more hurricanes than most other states. That increases a lot of the role and responsibility we have. So now I'll go through a little bit about CERCLA Superfund. It's his nickname. It's much easier to say Superfund than CERCLA. Try to even remember what the acronym came from. But anyway, that came in 1980, so that means Congress would have passed this law in 1980. And then an amended in 1986, it got allotted to what the meat of how it's actually put together. So again, that's a reactive law. So it's addressing previously contaminated sites. The big examples back in the 70s that led up to this was this Love Canal you may have heard of, Valley of the Drums, Kentucky. Ironically, that one's in one of our training classes on RCRA program, and I was in a class with one of the people who did one of the original work on Valley of the Drums. We talk about like it was all a done past projects near Louisville, Kentucky. And my current manager, who was the project manager, we have usually sometimes many times a site moves on. Well, it turns out they found more drums there. So here's a site that was an eyesore that led to we need to do something nationally from 1980, where even 30 years later they're finding new drums and new messes to clean up. So, but again, it's typically that was what it was for, to clean up abandoned sites where sometimes you don't have an owner or anybody left, somebody's bankrupt. That was the initial thing. So, and the CERCLA provides authority for the federal government to respond to the releases or threatened releases of hazardous substances. So again, could be, as we mentioned on the break, the last big one that got a lot of media attention, the vinyl chloride at the train derailment in Ohio. Again, we talk about the National Contingency Plan, so that's the implementation rules of Superfund, the procedures for conducting CERCLA. Again, establish a risk level that triggers cleanup action. Some of you have heard of 1 in 10,000 risks or up to 1 in a million risk. That's kind of our range. So ironically, maybe that's not the best word, but we often won't take action unless some risk is over 1 in 10,000 risk, like for a resident, commercial, industrial worker, or recreational. Whereas often the state may go to a lower level, like South Carolina, and I think Tennessee and Kentucky do also as DOE sites, where they may take action maybe at 1 in a million risk. It may not be the same kind of action obviously you take at something that's higher. So again, that amendment for Superfund was 86. That got into really the meat of how Superfund's together. But obviously we knew we had a lot of these federal facility sites out there, lots of DOD bases, a lot of Department of Energy sites with long history legacy of things they needed to clean up. They were cleaning up, maybe sometimes under the state RCRA program. So this executive order delegated to DOE and DOD the responsibility to implement certain provisions. So that's why they're called the lead agency. So again, that means they have to get money from Congress to clean up, hopefully based on what the three parties have decided that we'll talk about. So again, they must follow all the policies and procedures spelled out, again, in the implementation rules of Superfund. And again, and I'll get to this obviously a lot, but EPA either concurs with these remedies proposed by the lead agency, that's also the state, or picks another appropriate remedy. Hopefully that hasn't happened too much in the past, but I'm sure it has happened before where maybe there's a big disagreement on what remedy to go for. But as I'll talk about later, our core team approach, we don't usually have those kind of issues here. So again, the federal facilities are subject to the CERCLA requirements similar to private entities. That's one of the basics there. Again, let's just see the dots in our 8 states that shows the sheer number. I think nationwide there's still over 1,000 Superfund sites. So obviously there's not that many radiation sites, not that many DOE sites. Sometimes percent of land were one of the biggest, DOE especially, and some of the big DOD sites. And again, so if you're not familiar with Superfund, usually a typical private Superfund site, we might call it 2 operable units. It might be one that's like the soil around the building, and the second one might be the groundwater that's got contamination. So you typically have, and maybe the whole site's an acre or 2 acres, right? So, so that's typical Superfund site, usually small number of operable units. Well, Savannah River, we're over 99 operable units. Obviously, it's a very large 300 square mile site like Hanford and some of the other big DOE sites, so to give you perspective. And in our region, we have one of the largest numbers of DOE sites. That's why really Region 10, Seattle with Hanford and Idaho, and us with Savannah River, Paducah, Oak Ridge, and then Pinellas that used to make the tritium triggers for nuclear weapons. That's tritium facilities now at Savannah River. So one time we had 4. Again, Paducah shut down. That was a gas diffusion plant. Part of Oak Ridge also had a gas diffusion plant. It's been shut down too, but a lot of ongoing missions at Savannah River, Oak Ridge. So this was typical. I don't know about, not every DOE site got put on the list. Sometimes it was under a RCRA program like Portsmouth, which is a sister to Paducah. So for some reason it stayed under the state RCRA program for cleanup, where most other DOE sites moved over to Superfund, and then required to have a federal facility agreement, and that's have an agreement with the state EPA on priority of cleanup, trying to assess all the facilities that might need to be cleaned up, which we've been working on since '93. So I mentioned all of these are other acts. RCRA is the Hazardous Waste Safe Drinking Water Acts. Obviously, that's where we implement the drinking water levels in groundwater, even though it's not applicable because it's not a public water supply at Savannah River. But like any other, maybe a Superfund site, you're applying those same drinking water limits to a Superfund site. Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act. So as I mentioned, the 3-party agreement, that's in this case South Carolina, EPA, and DOE. So it governs investigation, remediation program, it goes to the roles and responsibility of each party. Obviously, we get to a lot of schedules and deadlines, milestones, documents we have to review, procedures, how we work together. And again, our role is to oversight of these remedial actions at Savannah River, so ensuring that things are done properly according to NCP, the implementation guidance, and the federal facility agreement, particularly for Savannah River. Technical procedural assistance, information, guidance, training, all kinds of things. So these next couple of slides just give you kind of a general of what we're looking at when we look at a site. Sometimes, again, most sites at Department of Energy have been discovered. This is really more geared toward maybe a new site we find, but that's not unusual even at Savannah River or Oak Ridge or other DOE sites where maybe a certain operable unit had not been addressed, and maybe because it was lower priority based on the contamination. So yeah, to investigate the site, looking at all types of media, risk assessment, determine really how somebody might be exposed in the public, whether it be an on-site worker or a future public. Again, how people can be impacted, you just kind of have to go through how things could get contaminated, whether it be drums or something in the groundwater, vapor intrusion that became a big issue in the last 10 years. Again, I won't spend a lot of time on these, but just kind of to give you a visual of how you can be exposed to things. This is one from radiation, where sometimes a little bit different radiation. We have the same in chemicals when it comes to ingestion of something or inhaling something, that's the same. But obviously chemicals don't have external exposure like from X-rays or gamma rays, which in chemicals they also have direct exposure, like something to the skin. Or dermal exposure, is usually something that's not in radiation. That's where the external exposure comes in our third pathway. So again, another one just kind of showing inside houses how you can be exposed to radon, radiation, et cetera. So again, so EPA and the state, we have concurrence required, so especially what we sometimes call the final document for a given operable unit, that would be the record decision. So we have many of those. So again, think back to the private Superfund site that might have 2 operable units, soil and groundwater. It's probably going to have 2 records of decision, how to clean up or address those contamination. So again, we get involved early and often, public meetings, these type of meetings when something new comes along, and we'll go through a lot of the process too. So again, so the decision process is at our remedial project manager level, RPM level. And again, as Susan mentioned, the core team process, which is one of the reasons why we get a lot of things done, especially the last 23, 24 years. And it's actually become one of the showcases across the Dewey complex. So Rob Pope, my predecessor, many of you know, Susan and Brian I think Rob helped put together a video from teaching that class that we've done here, we've done at other sites, and also at the big Waste Management Symposium, where we have usually almost every DOE site represented. So it kind of showcases how we do things and maybe trying to come up front, trying to work through some of the difficult details, as you can imagine. So I always bring up a site like P area where there was a difficult decision on groundwater cleanup, where I don't know if the state and EPA had one thing they wanted to do, DOE had maybe a lesser thing, but we had to compromise where we looked like we were going to reach, where we're going to go through, if another site might have gone through the dispute to finally make a decision at a much higher level. But we worked it through to feel we can do one thing now and maybe another thing later as part of the core team process. Yeah, so even our headquarters is often get involved. They're the ones that used to have to see every one of our record decisions or proposed plans, so they get involved actually how we're doing this. Even if DOE or DOD is the lead agency, they get involved. And especially since the last administration, I think that's continued, any remedy that's more than $200 million, I think there's even, any over $50 million has to be reviewed by our headquarters. So there's been a lot of those, obviously, at DOE sites, so it's over $50 million. That requires briefing, at least from the EPA side up the chain. Yeah, and the EPA project manager represents the core team decision. So anytime we're having a scoping meeting, we always make sure who's actually the core team member. It's not always the FFA, sometimes it's the individual person of the state or EPA or DOE that's the core team member. So we get to proposed plan, that's the public where the public gets involved on what we're planning to do leading to the record decision. Again, it's issued by DOE to the public, approved by us. So again, DOE writes this record of decision, considering public comments, and again, the key thing, core team is usually already weighed in by this point on exactly what we're doing. And then they would sign this record of decision. I think usually goes to South Carolina and then to us as the final signature, usually at our Superfund Division Director level. So again, it's trying to ensure the remedies designed and constructed according to plan, achieving all the objectives outlined on the ROD. This is called a remedial design or remedial action, where we actually implement that, and then regular effectiveness monitoring. And one thing that's unique to Superfund that I've actually used in a selling point for even some of my international work are these 5-year remedy reviews. So whether it's a private site with one operable unit that was finished in 2002, or a lot of our ongoing sites at Savannah River or Bridge that sometimes takes decades to get to some of these, we have 5-year reviews to go look at that decision that was done, whether it was that private site in 2002, that means every 5 years, they're going to assess to make sure the remedy's still in place. Maybe it's land use controls, maybe it's a groundwater monitoring system that's still working properly. And headquarters gets involved in those findings as well. So again, the decision documents we say belong to DOE, South Carolina, and EPA must sign a ROD for it to be final per the requirements of the NCP. And obviously by the time we're signing it, it's been well understood that we're all in agreement. So again, as again mentioned before, I won't go through a lot of this again, but the teamwork approach is really what helps Savannah River, having scoping meetings, often with a technical facilitator, working through some sometimes very difficult issues that some of us have a hard time understanding and making sure exactly what maybe DOE wants to do versus what we might want to do. Again, this kind of looks at all the different areas and projects. Some of you are familiar, some not, but that we get involved with, whether it's high-level waste tank program or each area on the site, where that's just kind of describing maybe what the main issue is at each of those sites, or groundwater or and again, even the 5-year reviews there. And again, important obviously to be field oversight and being constantly here at the CAB meetings. So now I'm going to, usually I end here, but I usually sometimes have example. I've had an example from some of the D area projects to kind of walk through how Superfund works in a given project, Savannah River. So again, that's just showing some of the details of Savannah River overall. So again, 515 waste units, 99 operable units. So we often talk about watersheds. We use this approach at Oak Ridge even more, with the water pressure approach, looking at different, I think I have one that's better showing the different watersheds, but these integrated operable units, we realize sometimes they're integrated because of the watersheds. So that's what leading up to the lower 3 runs that we recently did, upper lower 3 runs that we recently did a record decision for 2021. So a little bit on that. So this lower 3 runs, integrated operable unit, and its watershed, or that again in the Savannah River, it's a large blackwater stream that originated in the northeast part of the Savannah River, follows a southerly direction for 24 miles before it eventually goes into the Savannah River, and that's the tail you often see, this part of DOE Savannah River at the bottom, and considered waters of the state. That's very important. So this watershed drains 180 square miles, includes 2 Savannah River operable units, the P area and R area reactors. And again, remedial actions for source units at both their reactors have been completed, and you know those reactors have been completely entombed and finished, even though we have ongoing actions around those reactors. So the lower 3 ones was such a big watershed, it's been divided into 3 units. So the lower and middle were taken care of first, especially because the lower was more accessible to the public. That's that tail that went down to the Savannah River. So the upper portion was the one that Rob was our lead for us, and I think Susan was the lead for you or Heather for lower 3 runs, and then Brian Hennessy. So again, so this, you see the acreage in the Parr Pond, several smaller ponds, and all the canal systems that were all involved. Yeah, so again, mentioned before, large blackwater stream. So it contains the R reactor, a portion of the P reactor, and more importantly, Parr Pond. This again, it's considered waters of the state. So previous actions on the upper, middle, and lower in 1995, I before Rod just means there's an interim record decision. We have many of these in the private and federal facilities where sometimes some action's done, but it's not the final action on a given site, maybe because there's just so much to deal with. We're trying to maybe attack pieces at a time. And that certainly was the case with this whole unit. So especially at a water level for the pond to achieve radioactive sediments, again, there's a lot of cesium-137 that's been left over from some of the reactor releases back in the 60s, I think, mostly, that keeping the Par Pond full obviously shields it from any, especially workers. That would be the only scenario because, again, the public's not allowed in those areas. And then that was called a time-critical removal action, so excavation of contaminated soil and seeding in some hot spots, and that was based on a possible trespasser scenario. So even back then, they recognized that some spots were harder than others and decided to take care of that in that time-critical removal action. And these explanations meant significant difference to that 95. That means something that didn't really change too much to the original interim record decision that would have required, in other words, if it's a big change, it's going to be a ROD amendment and require another public meeting. And in this case, it was just adding, land use controls were added to the tail section, that whole section, again, below Savannah River, the stream after the dam. And this is the upper unit that we were dealing with in that recent record decision ROD, I think that was finished in 91. So again, the upper subunit. And that's divided into 9 exposure areas, and it's just the different colors in the bottom legend, if you can see that, green, pink, blue, just all the different little subunits of this exposure area. And that'll be important when we get to what options to address these sites. So this is kind of give you an idea in the remedial investigation, again, where maybe there's already been some preliminary information from Savannah River monitoring these sites for years. We did over 300 sediment samples we're taking, including flyover gamma data that they do on a regular basis at Savannah River like the other DOE sites. Over 100 surface water samples, fish samples, and then COCs, this means the contaminant concern. Sometimes you start with a potential contaminant concern. Maybe it was a list of maybe 15 radionuclides and maybe a few metals, and then you work which one to actually drive the risk decision, and sometimes it's down to 1 or 2 or 3. I'll have those, those coming up. And it turned out to be just radionuclides in this case, cesium-137, which has a little bit longer half-life. It's 30 years, so it's one of those that you can almost multiply any half-life times 10 to get an idea of how long that radionuclide is important. So obviously there's been a lot of 30-year segments since Savannah River started, maybe at least 2, right? So you got at least 8 more, so you can almost figure another 240 years that you have to worry about the cesium, whereas cobalt-60s is a 5-year half-life. So again, most of that would have decayed away in all the years that Savannah River has been operating. So, but these were still determined to be the ones that drove the most risk for either sediment or soil or the fish tissue. And again, tritium that's common on the site was also identified there. And this is kind of very simplified. We have very complicated ones that show the how people are affected. In this case, these 2 radionuclides are in the sediment. Who could get exposed? Obviously, remember, the public can't, so it can't be residential. It's not recreational area. That might be outside Savannah River. It's only the on-site worker. And in the fish person, again, this was where the cesium also and the tritium. So again, it's in the sediment, it's in the organisms, in the fish, and then somebody fishing where it could be exposed to that. So then what you have in the record decision, you have your remedial action objectives. Why are you making this decision? What are you trying to clean up to? And that's where you kind of state it what it is. That first one, you're protecting this integrated operable unit, this whole watershed, on-site workers from exposure to those 2 radionuclides in sediment soil that exceed the threshold, that's the 10 to minus 6, or background levels. And that's important for radionuclides since many are above 10 to minus 6 in background anyway. So even cesium-137, that's part of global fallout from all the atmospheric tests from the 60s and 70s, has a worldwide level that reduces every 30 years, and Savannah River obviously has almost the same number. So we have kind of an idea what those levels are. So sometimes you cannot get down to 10 to minus 6 for certain radionuclides and maybe certain metals as well. So conservative assumption that on-site workers will come into direct contact with the sediment drove that first one. And then protecting that recreational fishermen, that means they're not there all the time, not like a subsistence. And mercury and fish tissue, So the primary route of exposure, the ingestion of fish pathway, and then that's where you assume a fish person can gain access to the site or certain part of it and catch and ingest fish. So now I'm going to go through, we're not going to go through all the details of these, you can see those in the slide, but just really covering the alternatives and then what we chose. In Superfund, you always look at no action. If we don't do anything, obviously it's obviously a different cost, and sometimes you don't have anything. Well, what's the risk if you leave, if no action is taken at all? And this goes through the main alternatives. So it's either monitor natural recovery, land use controls. Again, land use controls usually the signs and other things to make sure that even the on-site workers of Savannah River don't get near those areas. The A3s and SU2 capping, that means capping in place of the principal threat source material, sediment and soil. Principal threat source material, it's one of those terms that's a little bit vague, but it's really trying to describe something that may be not that mobile, but it's also extremely toxic. It doesn't have to be both. Sometimes it's driven by something that's maybe 1 in 10,000 risk instead of 1 in 10,000, where some type doesn't mean you necessarily have to excavate it, but you have to make some kind of action to make sure it's maybe better protected. So that's that one. And then 2 more, there's the total excavation of some of these areas, treatment and off-site disposal of the sediment and soil. That would be literally taking up anything that was above your level of concern. And then A6, maintain watered and ponds. Remember I mentioned this big decision in 95 was make sure par pond always keep water over these sediments so it wouldn't be exposed. In this case, the on-site workers couldn't be exposed directly from the gamma radiation from the cesium. And then you this is just summary tables. I'm not going to go through these in depth. You're just kind of going through each contaminant on the left and which media, and you kind of go through each one. You're trying to evaluate which, in the case, the on-site worker at the top or fisherman, what's the background, 95th percentile, twice background, and then likely things. So that's kind of how the numbers are driven and how you come up with those numbers. And then you're going through this alternative comparison. And in Superfund, it's called the 9 criteria. So everything from just direct protection of the environment, chemical specific, mobility, long-term effectiveness. When I talk about ARARs, that means applicable or relevant appropriate requirements. That's like the drinking water, which can't be applicable because it's not public water supply, but it's usually appropriate because you're talking about groundwater and potentially drinking the water. So again, this is evaluating each alternative against all those criteria. Again, I'm not go through these in detail, you can look at those. But each criteria is weighed against all of those, try to determine which ones are more important than others. This is one that shows that each one can benefit from this monitor natural recovery, and obviously land use controls is always a key. But maybe very few would need to be excavated or maintain water. So then we get to what's called the preferred alternative for the upper unit, and that's where 3 of these were actually chosen. So that alternative A2, that was the land use controls with monitored natural recovery for the entire upper subunit. That was those little subunits 1 through 9. And then to excavate the principal threat source material that was in just one particular unit, that was the EA1. See there, that costs about just under $500,000. And the other one with just the monitored MNR and the land use controls is still $17 million. And then maintaining the water in the ponds, that was also important to make sure that was kept going instead of just assumed that it kept going. And so you see there, and that includes obviously dam maintenance and other things, where the total present worth for all 3 of those is $23 million. So again, that was one example. If you have any questions on that, but just kind of working through what we do in the Superfund process. Goes a lot of work in investigation and finding out all of that, but this is kind of end all what we do. It's been going on since the 80s. Will probably be another 30 plus years. Many people past us that keep this going. So again, that's been very successful at Savannah River. I know my management is always very excited that there's no big issues. In fact, recently my manager kept making the point, well, your Savannah River site sometimes gets neglected because unless you have an issue, sometimes it doesn't come up at the upper management level of what they're having to deal with. So that's a good thing. It means we sometimes have to reach out more. That here's how things are going great at Savannah River. Anyway, Any questions?
Narinder, we'll start with you.
How do you integrate Circula and NEPA?
Circle and NEPA, let's see, they are separate processes, and sometimes I'm evaluating both, but usually NEPA is usually something they're getting ready to build something that they need to have, make sure they get that approval or environmental impact statement. And it's a completely separate role than the Superfund site. So I think the most recent thing is the plutonium pits. Had to go through that process. And I was involved in that just because I work on anything radiation Savannah River, but it really was not my CERCLA role.
Does FFA get involved in both issues?
No, the Federal Facility Agreement is just dealing with the Superfund cleanup at the site, which sometimes does involve maybe something started under RCRA. We have some of those at all 3 DOE sites, and that continues under Superfund.
Any other questions from Sade?
I have a question about like what the implications of your results mean on your sample analysis of like the contaminants of concern on the LTROURI. Page number it is.
Is it this table?
No. Talking about the CS 137,
Yes.
CCM, COHG. Curious about you could explain to me a bit more about what that mean, what are the implications of those results?
Oh, of these numbers here? I think this case, you're trying to establish what the remedial goal would be. So I think one of the keys, so when you calculate the numbers, the key for cesium, again, is that it has a background level. So you're trying to make sure we can't get to 1 in 10 to minus 6, because background's around 1 in 10 to minus 5, or 1 in 100,000 risk. So that shows the on-site worker might be 0.144, but you can't get down to that level on Savannah River or any place on the planet. So we're trying to get, so there, that's the key thing for cesium is what is the 95%, that means statistically what's the number for cesium 0.34, and then maybe twice background. And that's usually kind of a number we use to say if something's at least twice background, that would be significant. If something's above that, then we know it's really Savannah River contaminating something that's not background. So again, we are almost right at background here because we're already above 10 to minus 6. If we were using 10 to minus 4, for example, then it might go up by order of magnitude what the cleanup number would have been. So instead of the most likely RGO 0.68, that's really just twice background, that means anything that's not considered background would be addressed by this remedy. If it was 1 in 10,000 risks, it might be 6.8. That means maybe you can not have to leave. Maybe some of the areas are no longer having to worry about that. So. And like Na for cobalt-60 doesn't have a global fallout number because its half-life is too short. So it's only released from reactors, whether it be DOE or Vogtle or any other reactor plant. So that's why it's NAs across the board for that. So that's purely just a calculation back. So even 1 in 10,000 risk for cobalt-60 is a very low number. In fact, that's below usually the detection limits of cobalt-60. So essentially the detection limits would be the limit of cobalt-60 if you were out there. If you were saying you were trying to excavate an area and you're trying to use instruments to tell if you got there, it would be really anything that's visible in the instruments. So. Any other detail I'm missing that you're wanting to know about?
I'm perhaps wanted to, I guess you kind of identify that process of what makes it significant, how you are able to, I guess, understand the Savannah River site's impact.
Savannah River impact? Well, first you got to pick who the receptors are. So again, it's not going to be a member of the public, but we do have, as you saw in the fish tissue, that could be a member of the public that fishes where they're not supposed to on site. We have the same thing at Oak Ridge, where, those areas are obviously have fences up. That doesn't mean you keep every person who wants to collect fish, especially in that tail. And I don't know if Susan or Heather know, or Greg, where they were assuming people come on and fish in this upper area. I don't recall that. But that's an example where you first determine who the receptor could possibly be, in this case, on-site worker and the recreational fisher person. And from there, that's how you go through. So maybe, again, maybe you started with 15 radionuclides and 10 metals, but all those fall out when you go through that scenario of exposure. You plug in all the equations. So.
Thank you.
Anything else from around the table? Saying none. John, thank you so much. All right. So it looks like you're going to get about 10 minutes extra for lunch, so use it wisely. Everybody be back in your seats at 1 p.m., and we'll get rocking and rolling again, okay? Thank you.